Hello, class. This week we turn to the topic of the reading process. We'll go into great detail in terms of what is reading, and this will prepare us for the question, how do we teach reading? Let's begin, though, by my sharing that I think we need to have a wider view of reading. We recently moved the term reading to literacy, acknowledging that reading and writing are parallel processes, but I really think that reading is rooted in life. And that's why in uh, my chapter in Total Literacy, I began by talking about Peter Spencer and his view of reading. Peter Spencer said, when you're talking about reading, are you talking about primary reading or secondary reading? And by primary, he didn't mean small kids. What he meant was central reading. In other words, to Spencer, central reading would be looking at an art print and understanding it, comprehending it, bringing your own interpretation to it. To Spencer, uh, you read when you walk outside and decide it's cold or hot and what clothes you will read. So all of those things are very important factors, and that's why I think Peter Spencer was a genius to talk about primary reading and secondary reading. Secondary reading, of course, would be when an author puts words to the page and is published and someone reads it in a secondary sense. So let's start off with a broader view of reading, and that is that reading is life, and reading is an author recording life in such a way that he or she can suggest something to someone else that reads it. But let's also think about what a child thinks about reading. And I think it's very important if you go back to the very first week of our course where we talked about theories of language acquisition. And the key theory there was cognitive field theory. And that is that we learn through cognition or thinking. And so that's why I'm a big fan of Rich Van Allen and his language experience approach. Van was a professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and he was doing his very best to teach people how to be teachers and how to teach reading. But after about 5 years of doing that, he became disgruntled when the football coach was paid more to quit than he had been paid in his 5 years as a professor. So he took a job in Harlingen, Texas, as superintendent of instruction. And there he was confronted with virtually a 99% ESL population and kids who were achieving at the 5th percentile on National Standardized Achievement Test. So Van came up with an idea that reading is language-based, and he developed the language experience approach by working with those kids in Harlingen, Texas. And he really wanted kids to think about language like this. What I can think about, I can talk about. What I talk about can be written down. What is written down can be read by me and by others. And ta-da, you have the language experience approach. From that, kids would be able to create word walls where they'd put some of the words from their dictation up. Children would be able to dictate their language to a teacher, and the teacher would write it down and create their own stories. And lo and behold, they could read their own stories because it was their language, it was their experiences. So a language experience became one of the major techniques for teaching reading in the 1960s and 1970s. It was one of the key strategies explored by the first grade studies in 1968 by Bond and Tinker. Somehow I think we've lost track of language experience, but I put it in this chapter for you so you understand it. And primary teachers, I encourage you to take dictation from kids. I encourage you to allow kids to make their own books. And I encourage you to let them read the books of their classmates. And when that happens, you'll see that reading comprehension soars. And it is the best pathway, I think, to learning to read. Also in this chapter, we talk about 3 ways that readers have access to reading. And those are the 3 cueing systems, the graphophonic system, the syntactic system, and the semantic system. On the graphophonic system, I actually have included 4 videos from a great first grade teacher, Kim Henderson, and she'll tell you about how she teaches Onset and Rimes in her classroom. I also want to talk to you about the most important of these cueing systems, and that's meaning or semantics. If a child is reading a book, trying to make sense of the book, then it's much easier to read it and comprehend it. And so that's why the semantic system, in my view, is the key. However, as a children's books author, I also rely heavily upon the syntactic cueing system, The books that Bill Martin and I write tend to have repeating syntactic structures, and since they are predictable. So, panda bear, what do you see? I see a rattlesnake slithering by me. Rattlesnake, rattlesnake, what do you see? I see a blue heron flying by me. You have that repeating language, and after the child has read it successfully on 3 or 4 pages, it becomes easier to read on the following pages, and that's the syntactic pattern. So we're going to be exploring syntax, semantics, and graphophonics as we talk about the 3 cueing system. Tompkins actually has a 4th system because she takes semantic and makes it even broader. To me, semantic says it all. It's the context. It's the broader sense. But it's up to you if you want to talk about 3 cueing system or 4 cueing systems. We even have a blog entry for you to talk about this week. I also want to talk about reading as transaction, because as a young PhD student, I came under the influence of Louise Rosenblatt and her transactional theory. And to Rosenblatt, reading is part of a complex arrangement she called the reader, the text, and the poem. And I love the word the poem. And to Rosenblatt, every time you read a story, you take the words of the author, you take your own schema or background experience, you take your own love, and you create something called the poem. And that is the text that the reader owns that is made by their interaction, the transaction with the author. So the reader, the text, the poem, I would encourage you to read that book by Rosenblatt. It is key, I think, to being a reading professional. I also would point out in Pathways to Literacy or Total Literacy, as this edition is called, the section of miscues, because I think it's very important for us to understand that when we're reading, we are reading more behind the eyes than in front of the eyes, as Frank Smith said. And what this means is really that we take the language in and our mind is ahead of our tongue as we're reading. Now, if you don't believe me, take up a novel, any novel you want, any book you want, turn on a tape recorder on your iPhone, if you will, an app, and read for about 2 minutes. And then I want you to listen to your own reading, and you're going to be finding that you have miscues. And actually, miscues sometimes improves the language of the author. So I want you to think about miscue, and miscue analysis is a powerful way of assessing kids and their reading process and where they are and what they're doing. And so miscue analysis is an important part of this chapter and what we're talking about this week. I'll conclude this lecture by talking about schema theory. Schema theory came out in the 1970s and 1980s as the United States government funded the Center for the Study of Reading at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And what occurred was there was a lot of research on the reading process, and researchers came out with something called schema theory, and that is that when we're reading, we comprehend based upon our experiences with what the writer is talking about. And so our background of experience is very, very important to reading comprehension. Thus, the wider view of reading would say that we need to be looking at building background of experiences. Instead of trying to teach minute parts of language, let's broaden it. Let's go for a walk in the park. Let's come back and take dictation about what kids say about what they've seen. I love the story by Rich Van Allen where the kindergarten went to a dairy, and while they were there, amazingly, a baby calf was born, and the kids wrote that down, and those dictated sentences are just amazing. But certainly, they got out of the classroom and into the world, and that expanded their schema. When your schema is expanded, schemata, if you will, then you are better able to comprehend what others write because they are suggesting experiences. Let me wrap this up by telling you that I'm an author. I write books, and I know that the books I write are not my own once they're out there, because every reader will read that book and they'll have their own comprehension of what I was thinking about. But their comprehension is the poem, if you will, that is the text that they have within them. So I hope you enjoy your readings this week and look forward to a lot of dialogue about it. Take care.